Hi, I'm Kyle Steinfeld, Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of California, Berkeley. Presented in this video is a talk titled Architecture After AI, which was presented at Carnegie Mellon University on February 16, 2023. The talk was organized by Associate Professor Dana Kopkova and was supported by a Steiner Visitor Invitation Grant. Hope you enjoy watching it. I'm gonna go through a talk today. I think it's about 30 to 40 minutes. And this is a talk that I prepared for a different context, to be frank. It was prepared for a recent symposium at UT Austin. And the call was to kind of consider where things are going and what it might mean to be sort of after AI, thus the title. So I took this call as a sort of an invitation to look forward in time to a moment in which the technologies, the tools, the processes that you're engaged with right now, everything that's kind of captured under actually a very broad umbrella. The term AI is huge, but let's just use it for the time being. After all of these sort of techniques have become ubiquitous, they're kind of just in the sort of mainstream sort of everyday life, which is happening very quickly in a range of contexts. Bing now has integrated into search, for example. So naturally, it's hard to predict the future when it comes to, well, anything, but especially like fast-moving topics like this. But like many amateur historians, I'm very amateur in that way, but I think that our best guide to the future is probably the past. And so as such, I'd actually like to devote most of my time not speculating on the future of ML and design, but instead talking about what brought us to this moment. So that'll be part 3. So that part is to address kind of the history of the specific technologies that you're using right now in your studio, the history of things like Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E, the whole sort of text-to-image generation tool thing that sort of suddenly and very visibly made their way into the public consciousness, the public architectural consciousness in the summer of 2022. So I'll spend most of my time today unpacking the sort of social and technical context that led to the tools that you're using right now in your studio. If you would indulge me in not one, but 2 threads of the history of technology, I'd actually first like to talk about why this moment in time might hold particular importance to the role that computers play in shaping design, culture, and practice. So that's part 2 of my talk before. So, and the question there is, can AI make CAD more human? So I'm thinking about like what the rise of ML tools might mean to the instruments of architecture, right? The instruments that we use every day. And before I get there, I'd like to start by offering some context of where I'm coming from personally. I think it's always good to just let everyone know like where I'm coming from, like what my position is, how I see myself, my background, et cetera, et cetera. So some positioning first, and at the end, I'll wrap up with a brief reflection and some questions for the group that I hope we can talk about. So there's my 4 parts. Positioning. So I think it's good to begin with a statement of values, what drives me, how I position myself in this field. And as I do that, I'll also show you some sort of creative work that I've been engaging in sort of in the background, but it's not really the focus of the talk. So in broad terms, I'm interested in humanistic applications of technology, of course, specifically in the context of computational architectural design. Generally speaking, I'm an advocate for augmentation, not automation. I'm not looking to replace any humans in the process of design, but rather augment our capabilities. I see that systems that we currently refer to as AI as cultural technologies. So much like writing or print or the institution of a library or internet search engines or even language itself, these are fundamentally techniques for transferring knowledge among groups of people. In a recent conversation I had with Ed Keller, he invoked the image of a person sort of surrounding by books. I think he was thinking of himself, and the human in that room sort of being limited by not having sort of memorized and synthesized all the facts in that library, right? Whereas in contrast, he was celebrating a kind of the potential of an AI partner as having been able, like having that capacity of being able to synthesize and have memorized the entire library. To me, this is wrongheaded. I think AI is less like a person in the room and more like the library itself. Right? The library is an extension of our intelligence as humans. It's a technology that exists to connect us to others and to connect us to knowledge that we wouldn't otherwise have. And so the AI is not a person, it's more like the library, right? So this idea that AI boils down to connecting people to the knowledge of other people, this is not to discount anything whatsoever. In fact, I find this really interesting because I see creativity itself as a network phenomena. So design tools, I think are cognitive instruments. We could say kind of intellectual prosthetics that connect us to the knowledge, skills, abilities of others that we ourselves would not otherwise hold, right? So I don't know how to calculate a perspectival projection of my 3D model via vector mathematics, blah, 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 but I've got like 600 years of graphic projection knowledge at my fingertips, right, in my laptop. Brunelleschi himself is in my laptop and does these calculations for me. Okay. So finally, and since it sometimes sort of comes up in this context, I'll just say that I'm skeptical about certain aspects of the whole like post-human thing. I see autonomous sort of machine intelligence or general artificial intelligence as a total red herring in this discussion. These things, they do not exist yet. They will not exist anytime soon. And I think that this discussion is actually a distraction from the real social impacts that the technology is holding right now as we speak. So I think it's better to just kind of get it off the table and talk about what's actually happening now, what we have in front of us. Okay. So some of my creative work here. So while I work in design technology, my interest in machine learning as an instrument of design actually stems from a kind of basic disillusionment with the existing state of computer-supported design, broadly speaking, how computers are supporting or not supporting design thinking. I'll touch more of this in the second part of the talk, but just in terms of background, I started working and writing about the potential of machine learning in architecture 6 or 7 years ago in 2016, 2017. The landscape then was really different than the landscape now. When I first started working with these systems, there were none of the kind of quote foundational models that power the tools and the apps that we know today. Training and running the kinds of models that produced the synthetic images and forms that you see on the slide right now, and also the previous one, required all kinds of things. I had to purchase a standalone Linux machine with a $3,000 GPU. I spent 3 days of setup time installing basic libraries such as CUDA and TensorFlow and NumPy, extensive data collection work over the course of weeks of training before even the first image was produced. It was tough. And in fact, the most pronounced change that I've personally experienced as an ML practitioner and creative person across the past 7 years wasn't related at all to the rise of Midjourney or any other software that we're using at the moment, but rather related to what I would call the infrastructures of machine learning. That is all the things that you need in order to participate in this space, right? It's much easier and much more accessible now to work with neural networks, broadly speaking. It's really quite remarkable. So this demonstrates the sort of, this is actually a slide that you'll often see at, or something like this at a neural network conference or symposium, demonstrating sort of the sort of progress that's been made. So this is an exciting moment for many of us. It's an exciting moment for me personally. I see that like creative machine learning is moving quickly from the domain of these relatively obscure systems that are only accessible to a small handful of really dedicated experimentalists into a much more accessible domain that more resembles something like commercial software and more easily accessible sort of services, right, as we're all experiencing. It's an exciting time. It's also an important time to think about what aspects of this previous experimental phase are worth preserving and what risks and opportunities await us in the realm of sort of more easily accessible, sort of more commercial versions of these things. Okay, so that's me. Speaking of thinking through these opportunities, one other thing that I'd like to make today, or thing I would like to do together, is to think through the potential impact of machine learning tools in design, just as your studio is doing, but in terms of the role that computers play in shaping design culture and design practice. And by that, I mean CAD. I'm just talking about like AutoCAD, right? Rhino, like things like that, right? So I'll ask for your indulgence. And actually, I'm just realizing I have to share my screen a bit differently because I have sound. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. Sorry. All right, so CAD history. Everyone loves CAD history. Let's go way back in time.
Hello, I'm John Fitch, MIT science reporter. We're at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory in Lexington, Massachusetts. a major research organization which has played an important role in developing this nation's defense system since World War II. And although Lincoln Laboratory is perhaps best known for its work in radar and advanced warning systems, it has also seen the beginning of the computer era and has made many important contributions to it. To learn about some of its recent work in improving the relationship between man and this important machine, we talked with Professor Stephen Coons, an associate professor of mechanical engineering at MIT and co-director of the Computer-Aided Design Project.
John, we're going to show you a man actually talking to a computer in a way far different than it's ever been possible to do before.
Surely not with his voice.
No, he's going to be talking graphically. He's going to be drawing, and the computer is going to understand his drawings. And the man will be using a language, a graphical language that we call Sketchpad, that started with Ivan Sutherland some years ago when he was busy working on his doctoral degree. And you will see a designer, effectively, solving a problem step by step, and he will not at the outset know precisely what his problem is, nor will he know exactly how to solve it. But little by little, he will begin to investigate ideas, and the computer and he will be in cooperation, in the fullest cooperation in this work.
So what did we just see in that clip? This was 1963. We were looking at Stephen Coons. Stephen Coons created the mathematical foundation of the surface descriptions that are commonly used today in CAD software. So B-spline surfaces, NURB surfaces sort of started with that person that we just saw, right? Coons is talking about Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad. Sketchpad is considered to be the first graphical user interface of any computer software, the first time that you had a graphical way of engaging with a computer, and also the first CAD application, the first computer-aided design software. So this is really the very beginning of computers as a kind of design aid, as a thinking aid. Right, so that's what we saw. What did we hear? First, we might notice that the claims that were made about the latest technology in 2023, are being made about the latest technology in 2023 are remarkably similar to those that were made about the latest technology in 1963, right? We heard a claim regarding, number one, a computer and a human entering into a relationship of the, quote, fullest cooperation. Does that sound familiar to you at all? Look at these headlines, right? If we continued listening to that same interview, we would hear a claim about a kind of radical technical leap forward from a computer acting as a, quote, very elaborate calculating machine into functioning, quote, almost like a human assistant, right? So each of these claims finds echoes in our current context, right? The current context, of course, being kind of overhyped AI-assisted, augmented, and automated design, right? So we've been here before. Yeah. Might things be different this time? Maybe, right? But first, it's worth noticing that CAD, as it developed from 1963 to 2023, has not worked out as planned, right? The initial promise of computation from 1963 as a partner in design has not been fulfilled. Why is this? To me, it's because our current computer-aided design systems impose rigid ways of working and thinking that are often not in line with how creative designers think, right? This is not just me talking, this is a kind of line of scholarship that's gone back a bit. So this is true of both dumb CAD and smart CAD alike, right? It's not the problem that the CAD systems are not smart enough. In fact, often the more advanced, quote unquote, advanced a piece of software is, the more acute this problem can be. So Grasshopper, for example, is, feels like as a user, as a more insistent partner. It insists that we adopt its linear relational sort of scripting way of thinking more so than something like Rhino. But both of these tools, all of these tools insist that we adopt its sort of way of thinking more than, let's say, a pencil, right? So the smarter technology doesn't really make it better. The smart technology, the dumb CAD, the smart CAD, they're both a problem. So maybe I'll put that in like more specific, concrete terms. We can observe that to be a, quote, expert user of any technological system is to accept the assumptions that underpin it, right? So prevailing approaches to CAD software have been fashioned to support particular modes of reasoning, particular ways of thinking. And to me, these are ways of thinking, modes of reasoning that are of only secondary importance to design activity. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by like modes of reasoning and design activity? To me, thinking through words and symbols is different than thinking through drawings and images, right? We heard the interviewer say, oh, this person, this man is going to talk to a machine using his voice. And Kuhn said, oh, no, of course not using his voice, using a drawing, right? Actually, I would prefer to use a drawing to talk to a machine, right? I would prefer to use a drawing to think about design than words. It's a much more natural mode of expression to me when thinking about visual media, right? So at the risk of oversimplification, we could think about sort of modes of reasoning in sort of three buckets, right? We tend to use symbolic logic, symbols, when we want to be deductive, that is, applying general principles to find specific solutions, right? So things like mathematics and coding would fit into this category. We tend to use linguistic logic when we want to be inductive, that is, synthesizing specific observations to find general rules. This is the world of words, right? Argumentation, discourse, critique. Third, we tend to use imagistic logic when we want to be abductive, that is, imagining possible solutions, given incomplete or contradictory information, finding our way through a problem. This often involves working with sort of visual analogy or drawing and sketching, right? So all of these, of course, are important to design. We do all of these things when we work through a design problem, but they're not equally supported, not equally well supported in the world of computation design. Historically, computers are like fantastic at that first thing, right? Like they're great at it. They are mostly useless when it comes to the second thing, unless you count things like, I don't know, social media and Zoom, right? But mostly useless in terms, like, unless you're thinking about communication. And when it comes to the third thing, they actively present obstacles to thinking in that way. So this is the kind of state of things that I would have made the same argument 2 years ago, 5 years ago, right? But to me, this is an exciting moment because this state of things might be about to change. And ML might finally fulfill one of the original promises of computer-aided design, as we saw in that video, which is to better align modes of reasoning, with modes of reasoning that are prevalent in design. Up until now, there have been very few computer-aided design tools, I'm going to quote Andrew Cudless, that have focused on expanding our imagination. And ML might be a tool, the first tool, I think, to like really focus on the expansion of imagination and analogical thinking through analogy and through images. So that's exciting, and it's really different than what's been done before. Why do I think that this is a possibility? A few reasons. Machine learning is fundamentally an abductive technology to me. It's not about kind of the exchange of symbols. It's about relationships. And it's also undeniably a cultural technology, right? And by that, I mean that it carries with it the kind of weight of cultures that produced it. So what I mean is, unlike traditional CAD, which has a posture of appearing neutral in a process, something like Midjourney, the cultural weight, like we're talking about bias, we're talking about representation of various cultures in this or not in this, right? Who's left in, who's included and who's not. You can't avoid that question in something like Midjourney, whereas you can easily, and we often do, with something like Rhino or projective geometry or et cetera, right? So ML tools are inherently historical, unavoidably historical and analogical and cultural, because they're trained on data derived from the world. They generate patterns drawn from the world, for better and for worse. All the bias in the world are reproduced in the bias of these systems. They're also inherently imagistic, insofar as they match patterns onto patterns. Their fundamental operation is recognition and like similarity, right? So by imagistic, I don't mean productive of images, although they often are. I mean that they are kind of relational and about recognition and similarity in that way. And finally, ML tools are inherently sort of curatorial. They position us differently than CAD positions us. In a traditional CAD system, we're kind of a composer. And parametric modeling, we're positioned as a kind of logistician or a mathematician, perhaps a coder. In ML, we're sort of a curator, right? We select things and have to build arguments around those things. So for this reason, I think that we might be at the cusp of something different. The story might be about to change. We might be at the first generation of CAD tools that offer computational support for abductive thinking and directly support kind of imagination, in a sense. Put another way, we spent the last 60 years learning to think more like a machine in design. Wouldn't it be nice if CAD thought more like us, if the machine thought a bit more like us? I think ML offers that, and I use the word thought in quotes because I don't think that there's any thinking going on, but I think ML offers us something of a possibility here. Okay. I'm going to pause for a second because I'm changing gears. Are there any questions or any thoughts before I keep going? I'm going to do the history thing now.
So hard to find these buttons. Any questions, Paul? No, that was an incredible summary, Kyle. I don't think I have any questions yet, but
cool. I'll keep rolling then.
Good.
So I'll try to move through this rather briskly because I'm aware. Actually, I'm not aware of the time because I have no idea what time it is. I do know that there is a time limit to the talk, but I want to go through what I promised, which is a kind of social technical history of text to image tools, which are the tools you're using right now in your studio. So as I mentioned before, there's a sort of transition that CAD, that ML is moving from the domain of obscure systems, only accessible to a small handful of dedicated experimentalists, and into a domain that resembles commercial software and easily accessible services, right? CAD went through that same transition from like 1960 to 1990. We're doing the same thing with this stuff, right? So it's an exciting moment. It's a dangerous moment for those of us who advocate for the humanistic applications of technology. I'll talk to those dangers a bit at the end. But first, I think our conversation about this moment in time would benefit from a sort of short unpacking of the social and technical context that led to it. So as I'm sure we're all aware, the software that's used by practicing architects typically is not made with our discipline in mind, but is adapted from tools developed from other contexts and systems designed for larger markets, right? There are certain tools that are developed only for architects, but they're often also developed for larger things like cinema or jewelry design or things like that. So most of the time, these new technologies sort of seep into our world of design in a bit of a trickle, giving those of us who work in design technology plenty of time to reflect and prepare for the changes that this kind of technology transfer might bring. And at other times, they like hit us like a rock from the sky, right? And the summer of 2022 was one of those rock from the sky sort of moments. It saw an explosion of architectural imagery produced by one of a series of text to image generation tools released one after the other in the span of just a few months. DALL-E, Midjourney, Stable, Image Gen, there's a whole bunch of them, right? So what led to this? Despite appearances, diffusion models such as this, we'll just call them diffusion models for shorthand for a minute. These are not sorcery, but they're rather tools that were produced in a very specific socio-technical context. And so while the impact of Midjourney and DALL-E and Stable and all of that might feel like a rock from the sky, of course, the tools themselves are not extraterrestrial in nature. They did not emerge fully formed in the vacuum of space, but rather they were rooted in a particular social context and arose out of a specific technical history. They were developed by people for a purpose. I'm going to draw way back to talk about like what rose to what led to that moment. I'll look at 3 moments in time that are, I'm sure, very familiar to those of us who are interested in these topics. One is the middle of the last century, sort of like what we just saw, the 1950s and 60s, but I'll look at it through kind of an AI lens. 2 is the turn of this century, the 2000s to 2010s. And then finally, events across a sort of 18 to 20 month period that led up to last summer. Across these 3 scenes, what should we look for? What is important to what should stand out? In each period, I'll focus specifically on 3 factors. First, there's the technology itself that includes both the kind of hard tech, the algorithms, architectures, models, data formats, et cetera, as well as the application domains. In other words, what real world problems were the researchers seeking to address, right? What were they trying to do? Second, I'll look at the social contexts in which the technology was produced. So that's public and private research institutions, so the kind of all the different things that support AI research and creative machine learning, informal online communities, social networks, creative collectives, et cetera. And finally, and as I spoke to at the beginning about my personal experience of like the infrastructure changing, I'll talk about the infrastructure and the access that makes this sort of activities possible. The tools, resources, software, platforms, programming languages, hardware accessibility, all of that is required for participation in this space, And that was a changing landscape as well. Why do I look at these things together? Well, it's because technologies, infrastructures, social structures, creative practices, all these things are intimately linked together. There's layers of dependency here at work here, far more than I have time to pull back in the space of a single talk. But let's dive in. So scene one, you probably might know, you probably will know, the field of AI developed in the 1950s, and it proceeded through the application of a sort of systems theory model of human cognition as the basis for machine logic. And what became known as the connectionist approach to AI. Some of the earlier work in this area was in the late 1940s and 1950s. They used networks of connected circuits to simulate intelligent behavior. Notable among these early models was the concept of the perceptron, seen being invented here in an actual photograph, which is totally not generated by Midjourney. The perceptron was a classification algorithm, first invented in 1943 and first implemented as a physical machine in 1958 by Frank Rosenblatt. Early AI research was, of course, far removed from practical application. While advocates, those who were involved in inventing it, they would extol its sort of potential applicability to a range of problems. The work itself was not proposed by pure academic interest alone, but was rather supported for its promising applications in national defense in particular. For example, at MIT alone, shown here being covered in piles of money, ARPA, later DARPA, contributed $2 to $3 million per year to AI research from 1963 through the mid-1970s. This money was provided with very few strings attached and contributed to what has been termed a kind of, quote, technological libertine atmosphere at MIT, an atmosphere that was strongly related to what we now call, quote, hacker culture. And this I'm taking from Sherry Turkle's work, The Second Self. So spoiler, I'm highlighting the perceptron here because it's the great-great-grandfather of modern machine learning systems. It also figures large, both at the start and the end of this kind of early period, as connectionism was abandoned in favor of another approach, symbolic reasoning, well, a collection of approaches based on symbolic reasoning. So it turns out connectionism is just one school of thought in basic artificial intelligence. Turning point of this period was Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert's 1969 book on perceptrons, which described their view of the limits of neural networks and offered a criticism that contributed to the first of two, quote, AI winters. An AI winter is a period of diminished progress in artificial intelligence, like a quiet period, but these quiet periods had less to do with a kind of natural progression of the technology. There was nothing natural about it. It had more to do with AI's visibility or invisibility. In other words, like cycles of public and private interest and investment, like usually driven by popular interest, and also the expectation of marketable outcomes, right? So when you think about an AI winter, don't really think about the tech, think about the culture that kind of surrounds it with public interest in it. So I don't have time to describe the sort of technological milieu of AI at this time and how it intersected with the creative and architectural world, but Molly is on the call and she has an excellent book on the subject called Architectural Intelligence. And it talks about how this time period intersected with architects and architectural thinking, figures such as Christopher Alexander and Cedric Price, Nicolas Negroponte, and others. But instead, I'll just turn to a summary of this period, and I'm mainly trying to set this up to help shape our thinking for the periods that come, right? So here are the four categories that we care about. There's the technologies. So at this time, a set of technologies were developed that formed the foundations of the connectionist approach, right? The neural networks, these get revived later. The application domains, what is interesting, what kind of problems were people working on? They were looking at things that had application to national defense. So that included machine translation. Can I point a camera at an enemy boat and read the number off the side of it and have it translated? Natural language processing, reasoning as search, this sort of thing. The social context in which this occurred is what you would expect. So all this research is happening in academic labs at R1 research universities. You guys are currently sitting in the middle of one, right? The funding for this was dominated by government grants, often military related. The Navy was involved a lot, with very limited private money, the kind that we would see today. And in terms of social context, here I'm looking at like who has access to resources necessary to make contributions in the space. Obviously, given the nature of the technology at the time, it's a very limited access, right? A great deal of expertise is required, a great deal of money is required. Huge compute, like infrastructurally, it required these large computers made by made by IBM and others, very expensive, right? Okay, so that was like the scene in the middle of the last century. I'm going to jump forward now to the early 2010s and leave aside an inexcusably large body of important history at the interest of getting through a presentation in a reasonable amount of time. So suffice to say that the AI winter of the late 1970s that I mentioned before led to an AI summer in the mid 1980s. This was propelled by, among other factors, an infusion of funding by the Japanese government, followed by a second winter in the early 1990s. And then the most recent thaw that we're, of course, preceded the sort of springtime that we're currently enjoying, also happened to reestablish connectionism, neural networks, as the sort of dominant tribe in AI. Once again, none of this development occurred in a vacuum. In fact, lots of things changed across this 50-year span. Two major changes relevant to this discussion. Number one, it's sort of obvious to say, computers got faster, right? This is both in terms of general processing speed and also the development of dedicated graphic processing. GPUs were developed across this time. Number two, and I think far more important, the world started producing and storing vastly more data than we had in the past. And the second point is really the crux. Across the first decades of our current century, access to large amounts of data and cheaper computers to store and process this data radically transformed the global economy and really allowed the development of neural networks to thrive. Culturally speaking, the expansion of computing power and resources is not just an opportunity to do more, it's also a huge problem to be solved, right? So to illustrate the scale of this problem, I hope you can see there's a tiny dot all the way to the left of the screen. And that tiny dot is a few thousand petabytes. So let's describe it in common terms, 3 billion gigabytes, 3 billion gigabytes. So in 1997, computer scientist Michael Lesk estimated that there was 3 billion gigabytes or so of information in the world, right? Not information on computers, information in the world. Like the total amount of information that's possible, known by humans, right? Including the contents of all libraries. He thought it was about 3 billion. He also predicted that data storage would match this capacity by the year 2000, at which point we wouldn't need to expand storage anymore. And he also predicted that most of this data would never be looked at by a human being. So he was right on the third point. Most data produced in the world is never looked at by a human, but he was wrong in the first two, obviously. In the middle dot, that's 13 billion gigabytes. In 2011, McKinsey Global Institute estimated that 13 exabytes, that's 13 billion gigabytes. This amount of information was being created and stored on computers by companies and consumers every year, right? So the dot on the left is an estimate of how much information there is total in the world. The dot in the middle is, and that was in 1997. The dot in the middle, 2011, that's how much, this is an estimate of how much information is being created and stored on computers every single year, right? And of course, you know the end of the story, the huge square on the right. This is the volume of data produced today, 2021. Of course, we're guessing, estimated to be around 94 zettabytes. This is the amount of annual production. So total amount of data produced every year and stored on computers, that's 94,000 billion gigabytes. So much more. So you see the problem. So this phenomena, like the unfolding of this as a problem more than an opportunity, was known in the early 2010s as big data. And this is something which did intersect the architectural world, right? Big data as an opportunity and also a problem. Deep learning as a technology, we need to understand the technology we're using today to make images on our computers was developed to solve this problem, right? Deep learning is a technology to cope with the avalanche of data that filled our world starting around that time. So this is a kind of well-known and well-studied story. It involves the transition from technologies, I'm talking about neural networks, propelled by the need to address wartime logistical problems, transitioning to technologies propelled by the needs for governments and private interests to more effectively sift through a steadily increasing volume of data about people. That is to say, a transition of technologies of war to technologies of mass surveillance. And this is what we work with every day, right? So the problem of big data and the perceived opportunities for surveillance and for commerce, this provided the motivation and the justification for the technological innovations and the new funding structures that took place in this period. And this, of course, period set the stage for the period that we're now in, right? So again, a summary of the period to help us compare it to what we're in now. In terms of technologies, there were a range of technologies that were sort of relatively quietly developed in the mid 1980s and 1990s that refined and extended the capabilities of neural networks that enabled the kind of widespread application of different forms of machine learning to practical problems in the world. So these technologies included convolutional neural networks, backpropagation, autoencoders, transformers, etc. And these are like the basic things that underlie way, way deep the things that we use. In terms of infrastructure and access, to support this technological development, a number of pieces were required. Importantly, and we don't often think about this, but some foundational data sets were established in this time that directly supported machine learning research in relationship to this like newly defined set of like application domains. So this includes the establishment of the first handwriting data set, the ImageNet, which is the first image data set, and CFAR 100, which is another different image data set. The nature of these image data sets structure the kind of position and the capabilities of the tools that we use today. So that's why I think it's important. Also important is the foundation of what we now would call the cloud infrastructure is established, like things like Google Drive that we use every day. That was established at this time. And cloud computing, like cloud compute was also established, making high levels of sort of GPU services available. So Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud Platform, all of these kinds of things were established at this moment. In terms of application domains, like what people were looking at, it's turned from sort of military applications to public perception applications. So the problem domains are really valued at this moment for their commercial application in sifting through large amounts of data. So like image search, Google image search developed around this time, handwriting translation, also valued for their kind of visibility and the marketing applications for tech firms. So people realized that AI winters had more to do with the visibility and the public perception of these technologies than the technologies themselves. So we start getting like public perception shaping events like Deep Blue beats Kasparov in chess, right? We all think about IBM when that happened. AlphaGo beats Lee Sedol in Go, right? And we all think about DeepMind. So these events were intended to shape public perception and keep the flow of money flowing, right? In terms of social context, some changes here. I'm looking here at the organizational structures that support these developments. Things look a bit different than the previous period. Academic research labs have expanded and proliferated. So Oxford, Stanford, MIT, everyone's got, I mean, a lot of these were a little older, but now everyone's got an AI lab, right? And all the academic institutions have an AI lab. Also, private research labs are established in this period. So big tech firms like Google and Microsoft, they established like dedicated AI research groups around this time. So a lot of this was propelled still by a revival of government funding and interest, still provides the bulk of the support, but we also begin to see private backing of ambitious, quote, moonshot AI research around this time. I can't go through the history and get to my final scene without mentioning some of the earlier sort of creative technologies that were developed in between. I can't, it's hard to get through a talk about creative ML without mentioning things like Deep Dream, 2015, the first synthetic image ever produced on the left of this sort of puppy slug, and GANs, generative adversarial networks, which remain important, but are no longer the kind of cutting edge of image synthesis. That's my image on the right, 2014. These are both well known in the ML community, maybe to this community as well, hugely impactful technically and culturally. Things like this really drove what we might begin to call, bye Molly, generative aesthetics from like 2015 to 2020, right? So this enabled a range of important artists. So final scene, and I know we're almost there, Scene 3. So I'm focusing really at 12 months of time. So January 2021 through January 2022. So immediately before the summer where things really exploded into the public imagination. And I would argue that our current springtime of generative AI began in January of 2021 with a particular event that led to a series of events that brought us Midjourney and similar. I won't rush. Okay, cool. I'll slow down. So all of this action at this moment came about because of the specific social and technological context that I just described across the previous scenes, right? what makes it different, like this period is really marked by a kind of level of accessibility to technologies that drive these tools that's nearly unprecedented. And that accessibility sparked a whole range of innovations. So between like the intervening like 5 to 10 years between our last scene and this one, emphasis in this area, excuse me, emphasis really shifted from like basic theories and basic developments to kind of applications, sort of from developments and foundational technologies to developments and infrastructures that made a difference. And the establishment of these infrastructures really hold deep impact on the social production of creative work, and I think are making their way into architectural creative culture now as well, right? It's going to change the way that we work, I think, across the next few years. By infrastructures, I mean things like the availability of a published model, the open sourcing of an architecture for a model, an open sourcing of the weights for a model, and I can explain the difference between those two things, and very importantly, access to compute, right? Having access to powerful computers. All of this has enabled what we might understand to be sort of non-affiliated research labs, and also empowered casual technologists, both of which are kind of new categories in the world. It enabled like these sort of non-affiliated folks to make real contributions that hold wide impact. And here in this, of course, scene, we meet our protagonists. Text-to-image systems are our protagonists. These are the tools that kind of sparked the deluge of synthetic images in the summer of 2022. They are a direct product of a series of technical innovations that take place within an unexpected social context in the 18 months that I'm talking about, the 18 months that preceded that summer of 2022. Take, for example, the quote, non-affiliated research lab. What does that even mean, right? So in contrast with like, you know, MIT, CSIL, or whatever, the AI lab established by MIT that's been around for a long time, you've got a group like this, eLuther AI. This is a non-affiliated deep learning research lab founded in July of 2020. It is self-described as a, quote, decentralized collective of volunteer researchers, engineers, and developers focused on AI alignment, scaling, and open source AI research. What is this in practice? It's like a bunch of unpaid knowledge workers collaborating on passion projects and organizing their efforts on Discord and like not getting paid for it, right? It's and organizations like this have actually made really serious contributions in the open source re-implementation of published research by larger, well-funded labs, also in the maintenance of important large data sets, but also in the invention of like entirely new architectures. So this is like a new phenomena in the world that basically unpaid volunteers and hobbyists would make important contributions to a technical space like this, right? So across this period, we find that innovation is no longer the providence of large academic institutions and closed corporate labs, excuse me. In fact, like a number of what has been called clever little tricks cooked up by independent creative actors, these are directly responsible for the events of summer 2022, alongside work from larger labs. So I think it's better at this point to depart from a kind of chronological story of what happened and shift to like an instrumental one. So the diffusion models that are our subject today, these are an amalgam of technologies, each holding its own provenance, right? So let's start by taking a diffusion model apart and do a quick biography of the elements of the diffusion model. So the core technical elements of all contemporary text-to-image tools are right there in the name of the underlying technology. So the full name is clip-guided diffusion for the things that we use, right? The kind of generic name for Midjourney and Stable and ImageGen and all of that, right? So clip-guided diffusion, there it is in the name. It's an amalgam of two systems. On the one hand, you have diffusion. This is responsible for the composing of synthetic images. So diffusion was developed between 2015 and 2020, primarily in academic labs, specifically Stanford and UC Berkeley, go Bears, in a fairly open source manner, right? So you can track this through the academic literature. On the other hand, you have CLIP, C-L-I-P. This is responsible for guiding the diffusion process towards an image that matches a given prompt. CLIP was developed in 2021 by a private research lab, OpenAI, which you might have heard of. They're the same people that did GPT-3. OpenAI released both the architecture of CLIP, that is to say, the blueprints of how to make one, as well as the weights for the trained model, which is to say, a working machine developed from those blueprints, in January of 2021. Why did they release it publicly? I don't know why they did that, but it was a pivotal moment and kind of marks the beginning of a series of innovations that lead us to today. So let's look at that in a timeline. So there we are on the left, January 2021, OpenAI releases this thing called Clip, which I haven't explained, right? I'm going to talk about a series of innovations. Well, I did explain it a little bit. Clip is the thing that understands text in relationship to images, but doesn't make images. Something else has to make the image. There's a series of innovations between there and January 2022 that I'm going to show you in detail now. Neither Clip nor Diffusion was kind of the first of their kind systems. But they were the first, like when combined, they were the first to kind of find real success. But this success was only found after a series of experiments with slightly different ingredients. And I'm going to walk us through those, right? So on the left, you see the very first image produced by a clip-guided process, a synthetic image produced by a clip-guided process. It was made in January of 2021. It is titled Sexy Alien. And it was made by the first person to connect Clip to any kind of image generation function outside of OpenAI. And that person was Ryan Murdoch. Ryan Murdoch is a self-taught machine learning engineer. He has a bachelor's of psychology from the University of Utah. I think he's in his early 20s. He later joined Adobe to work on neural filters, but he has no formal training in machine learning whatsoever. This was a passion project. There's no diffusion here. Instead, it uses what's called a sinusoidal, I don't know, representation network, SIREN, which is like this acronym, as the generative model. And the work produced like the first synthetic image generated by Clip. To provide a comparison, so I'm going to take you through a whole bunch of these tools. To provide a comparison of like what they were capable of, I've made a set of images here myself based on the same prompt, same two prompts for every tool. So on the left, you see an image generated by this tool in January, that was invented in January 2021. I made this image yesterday, but the tool was made before, right? And the prompt was interior photo of a house, thin wooden construction, scaffolding, architectural, HD, HQ, 4K, 8K. You can tell this is like very like the prompt came from a Mid-Journey thing that I borrowed from someone. On the right, a professional photograph of a brutalist museum in Berkeley, California. I have one in mind, but it doesn't really look like that. So I think it's just like worth like looking at these images for a bit and like think about the sort of the capabilities of the tool and the aesthetics that are enabled by each. Across this whole series, you'll see a theme of sort of moving from sort of textures and fields that evoke a sort of feeling of the prompt to figures and objects. And of course, things as you would expect would become much more refined. But it's worth noting that this is the state of the art just 2 years ago, right? This is the best we could do. Next came this tool called Big GAN plus Clip or times Clip, I don't know. That was a month later, February 2021, also Ryan Murdoch. This was the first time that Clip was connected to a GAN, which is a different technology for generating images. Here we're using Big GAN as the generative model. I'm going to speed up a bit. On the left, an interior photo of the house. I don't see it. On the right, a brutalist museum. If you have any experience with Big GAN, these feel very Big GAN-y. They have a very kind of Big GAN aesthetic to them. Next is an experiment called Aleph-2 image or Aleph-2 image, February, so the same month. Again, Ryan Murdoch, he's doing a lot. So this doesn't actually employ Clip, but I think it's worth mentioning here because it demonstrates the diversity of possible architectures that could be applied to these problems. So here, Murdoch is basically taking apart DALL-E, which exists at this time, DALL-E 1, and using only the image generation part, which is a variational autoencoder in order to generate images. And this is what we get from it. I feel like we haven't taken a step forward here. It is worth noting that sometimes in these sorts of images, you begin to see the text of the prompt appearing sort of in the generated image. Things are getting better. This is June 2021, June of the same year. This is VQ GAN plus Clip. So it's again combining a GAN with Clip model. All of these are text to image, of course. This was authored by a person named Catherine Croson. Catherine Croson is also not trained as a machine learning engineer. She's an artist. And this became one of the most widely forked, like something plus Clip image generation systems out there. And this is, at this point, the generative art scene took notice of the potential of Clip guided systems to make images like that. And things really began to spread in June of 2021. Here are some images that I made with it. On the left, the same prompt, the interior photo of a house. On the right, professional photograph of a brutalist museum. You can see things are, at least on the right-hand image, becoming a bit more figural. I could point at something in that image and say, oh yeah, that's the museum, right? On the left is sort of more textural. I think it's because it's an interior photo that I'm looking for there. But let's see, here's another example. This was clip guided diffusion. So here, Croson again is using diffusion. This is August 2021. And the quality, you can see the quality is getting more photographic and getting a bit better. A real turning point was this, disco diffusion. This remains an active project. The original model was made by Catherine Croson, and it was translated, and then a whole group, like a whole creative collective of like at least 15 people that I can find that are named, helped develop this thing. And it was really artists that were interested in making psychedelic animations, like the one that's on the screen right now. Very much a kind of collective effort that used diffusion plus clip, plus I think what you're using for depth estimation is called Midas. You might be using a different one. They used Midas to do depth estimation, and then a camera transformation, and then a regeneration. Anyway, so this was October 2021, and so it's really making a big difference, a big splash within a kind of small community of generative artists. Here are two images that I made with it: the interior photo house, or the house on the left, the Brutalist Museum on the right. So that's October 2021. A few more. Let's see. This is disco. That's not disco. Oh, that's incorrectly labeled. Sorry. That's something else. I'll get you. I'm gonna send. You know what? I'll just do it now. So I'm gonna copy paste into the chat. I can send it via email later if it's easier for y'all. This is a list of everything I'm showing today, along with a link to a Google Colab notebook that I kind of copy pasted and grabbed as a historical record of like what to do with these. So this is called Aphantasia, and it's by Adam Epstein.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Incredible resource. I can't believe you just did that. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. This is like some of these make little animations that are like sometimes like the process of the image being formed. That's what you're seeing here. And others make videos for other purposes. So like that, yeah, so there it is. Yeah, Epstein, Aphantasia, and that's, I don't know, December 2021, I guess. So in summary, like 2021, I'm sorry, in 2021, some people released like a bunch of collab. All of these things are happening in collab notebooks, right? And their intent is to make psychedelic art in like clever ways. And it turns out that all of the text to image tools that made a big splash in our world led to moments like this, like DALL-E 2, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, ImageGem, all of them that came out of the big tech labs are using the techniques developed by this community of artists. They're all a direct product of the things that I just showed you. A bunch of creative folks passing around Google Colab notebooks, doing their cloud computing for free on Google servers, collaborating on Discords, bragging about it on Reddit, posting images on Twitter, right? This is what led to, and of course, using the basic elements developed by the large labs, but for a very different set of purposes. And this is what developed into the tools that we use now. I'm projecting forward now beyond that January 2022. So this is in January 2022, clip guided deep image prior. I don't have a attribution on this, I'm sorry, but there's a photo of the house and the Brutalist Museum. So I'm just gonna complete the story here. Some animations of the images forming, and this is released just prior to Midjourney and Stable and all of that. And then here we have Midjourney version 1, which is June 2022, same two prompts. Midjourney version 2, August 2022, I think, same two prompts. Stable Diffusion 1.4, August 2022, same two prompts. I'll go through these quickly. Midjourney version 3, December 2022, so a few months ago. And Stable Diffusion 1.5 around the same time. And now, Disco Diffusion is still happening, right? People are still doing it. So this is where Disco Diffusion is at as of December of last year. There's also a lot of interesting innovation that continues parallel with the sort of more commercial stuff. So this is a pixel art animation generated by Disco Diffusion by me yesterday. So it's like they're starting to develop these like very specific aesthetics. So this is a person named Rivers Have Wings. I don't know her real name on Twitter, but she developed a kind of tangential offshoot of Disco Diffusion that only does pixel art, right? Like 8-bit pixelated stuff. And so this is a professional photograph of a Brutalist museum in Berkeley, California, animated as pixel art. So there's room, of course, for innovation here, while the big companies, Midjourney and Stable, are interested in like photorealism really more than anything else. So here's January, like I did this actually yesterday, but with this model was released very recently on Stable, same true prompts as Midjourney, as you can probably tell. And we're very figural, very kind of painterly, photographic, I suppose, here. And they have their different characters, Stable and Midjourney. Just a couple more. And I think we're now at the latest models that are available. So to recap that timeline, and like kind of recalling that series of faces that I put in towards the beginning of the talk. In January 2021, we were at the state of the art was the image on the left. And January 2023, 2 years later, the state of the art for the same prompt is the image on the right. So things are obviously developing really, really quickly. Okay, so let's take a moment to kind of see this recent history through the lens of our analytical framework that we developed over the course of those two scenes. And that'll let us see very clearly how the current moment is so distinct. I've already talked about the specific technologies that were developed recently that catalyzed the sort of burst of interest in text-to-image architectural circles, right? So CLIP is important to know. Diffusion as an image generation process is a state of the art. GANs are also important, but they're being used less now. I've also described the infrastructure that enabled the widespread access that was required to make these advances. So Google Colab, GitHub for distribution of these things, the cloud infrastructure that enabled access to compute, Discord for collaboration. All of these things were happening on like Discord workspaces or whatever they're called, servers, Reddit for bragging about it, Twitter for bragging about it, etc. The social context in which these advances took place were largely kind of established in the previous time period, but they're worth emphasizing here, right? So the usual institutional players, the big tech labs like Google and OpenAI are important. The academic institutions like Berkeley and Stanford and LMU Munich, which developed some stuff. I suppose CMU, I don't know. Those are also important, whoops. And we also, but I think notably, we also find these like independent labs and nonprofits and community-driven efforts like eLuther AI, Stability AI was sort of one of those. It's now kind of more for-profit. These groups made important contributions as well. And very important contributions were made for and by communities of creative practitioners that were totally unaffiliated and doing this because they love doing it. And Disco Diffusion is a prime example of something like that. So if there's something to take, like one thing to take away from this history, I hope it's this: we live in very exciting times. Creative machine learning has never been more accessible, including to people like you and me, right? Including to everyone in this room. In the very recent past, big, important, culturally like shifting, contributions have been made, not only by large institutional players that you might expect, but not by Autodesk, not at all, right? But instead by communities of creative practitioners that are not so different than the people in this room. So that to me feels really empowering and exciting. So as you can see, I personally feel this is a very exciting moment for computational design, for creative machine learning. I also can see, though, it's a dangerous time for those of us who advocate for the humanistic applications of technology. So getting past the history, I feel like the conversation wouldn't be complete without a frank discussion of the risks. And I hope that this sets us up for a conversation for however much time we have. What are those risks? Well, I'll frame this in terms of 3 questions for the group. And these are, I'm kind of borrowing these from conversations I've seen happening in fine art circles. So first, might AI, I'm going to use that term very broadly, wreck existing cultures and scenes in design? So like the constantly shifting dynamic of fields like architecture, I don't know what it means to wreck or to rebuild because there's so much churn there anyway, but certainly some would benefit and some do not in moments of change like this. Second, might AI produce a shift in the centers of power in design? And this might be worth diving into more deeply. So for example, architects are a part of a broader network of, social, technical, financial, cultural exchange alongside clients and contractors and developers and a multitude of publics. How does this technology figure into that? And in this context, we have to ask who profits, right? Who is empowered by a change? Architectural work is already beset by huge inequities and exploitation. In what ways might this make things worse? In what ways might this make those who are currently disempowered more empowered? Finally, might AI devalue certain aspects of the craft of design? And this has to do with the power dynamics, of course, as well. But text to image is a classically disruptive, quote unquote, technology. And as such, it makes winners and losers, right? Silicon Valley loves its disruptive technologies, right? Those who make their living in architectural visualization, for example, might not be so excited about lowering the barriers to make an architectural visualization, right? That's a challenge to them. So typically in situations like this, the winners tend to be tech savvy and willing to adopt new ways of working, whereas the losers are less tech savvy and less willing to adopt new ways of working. This was the case in the rise of parametricism. I personally benefited from being tech savvy in that moment. It got me my first job out of grad school, right? But the dynamics here are really different, and I don't yet know how they will play out. These tools are nothing else if not accessible, right? It's not like only the nerds in the room can do it. Everyone can do it. Look around on Instagram or Twitter or whatever, right? The spaces are filled with compelling and imaginative images, each of which was made in seconds. I don't know if there's anyone who studied economics in the room, but what happens when a product becomes, on the one hand, much easier, when it just like becomes easier to produce? On the one hand, the market experiences a surplus, as we're experiencing right now, so many images of architecture. Number two, the product is radically devalued, right? So I think we're entering a phase in which architectural images, architectural image making is cheap, quick, and easy, and also potentially holding radically less value, both culturally, right, and to an individual than it has in the past. And I think that this is a danger, right? And I think the question really remains, how will this flood of both, on the one hand, very beautiful, on the other hand, radically cheap images change our discipline and change the way that we do architecture? And I'll leave it there.